I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing the events in the Gulf and their impact on the wider Arab Middle East. I'm joined by a group of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. At the time of recording, one of the gravest impacts is now being felt on the streets of Holy Jerusalem. Just as the secret relationship between Saudi Arabia and the apartheid state of Israel was looming largely into public view for the first time, the siege on Al-Aqsa turned out to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and not just for the Palestinian people, but for the Arabs as a whole. Despite cholera, starvation, famine, and endless bombardment, the people of Yemen in Sana'a were out in their millions demonstrating for Al-Quds, Al-Aqsa. All over the Arab world, people are rising up. All over the Muslim world, people are rising up, saying enough is enough. Bit embarrassing for the Saudi Arabian regime, their relationship with Israel. But we'll be looking more widely at the impact in the Levant as a whole, because, of course, the Syrian Arab army and its allies were already well on the way to a military victory over the jihadist, fanatic, extremist attack upon their country. But the crisis, the falling out of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, has very definitely, well, as we say in English, put the tin hat on it. Because, of course, it has now led to further division within the extremist infiltrator ranks, as people, on the basis that he who pays the piper calls the tune, those that have been funded by Saudi Arabia are now fighting against those that had been funded by Qatar, and by extension the other minor satrapies in the Gulf that do exactly what Saudi Arabia tell them to do. So the division, further division, there were already many divisions, but the further division of the anti-Syrian forces still present on the battlefield in Syria is, of course, a tremendous boost to the government in Damascus and their armed forces, their heroic armed forces, who have performed a military feat of Stalingrad proportions in defeating the invasion of dozens of countries and their proxies of the Syrian Arab Republic. But there are other impacts too. Who'd have thunk it? Saudi Arabia is now pumping in money and propaganda to the Kurdish people, whose long plight the Saudis managed to miss this last century or so. But they've now woken up to the plight of the Kurdish people and the rights of the Kurdish people to some form of self-determination, some form of self-rule. The Saudis have got right behind the Kurds. How could that be? Why would that be? Well, of course, it's to punish Turkey, because Turkey has sided with Qatar in the GCC fallout. Now, at the time of recording, it may be that that fallout under American pressure has begun to lessen. There is every possibility that by the time you see this program, that the worst aspects of the siege on Qatar, launched by its GCC allies, imagine, will have been lifted. But the enmity that will have been left behind, and the enmity which lies behind the division in the first place will certainly not go away. Qatar has, as I predicted here a couple of shows ago, steadfastly refused to capitulate to the demands of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Saudi king or crown prince and the lesser satrapies lined up behind him. And that's not going to change. So already, actually, Saudi Arabia has suffered a major defeat in its foreign policy, just as it has been defeated in Yemen, just as it has been defeated in Syria, and is being defeated on the cobblestones of the old city of Jerusalem as I speak. Well, that's my free word, that's my كلمة حرة. Let's see if our audience of distinguished experts have a different take, or a similar take, put better than I'm able to do it. Yes, Dr. Marcus, please, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, and I'm the editor of Politics First magazine. In regard to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, I think it's good to see these two terrorist-supporting cutthroats going for each other. Both Saudi Arabia and Qatar are up to their heads in Syrian blood. What they have done in Syria since 2011 will never be forgotten, will never be forgiven by the Syrian people. And indeed, the threat, the terrorist, religious extremist threat, which stems from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, is not just a threat to the Middle East or to North Africa, it's a threat to global humanity. Indeed, it's a threat to each and every one of us when we made our way to this studio today. But I think, George, a question we need to ask is this. To what extent is this a real falling out between Saudi Arabia and Qatar? I'm not so sure it actually is. I certainly don't think there will be a war between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. I certainly do expect, probably by the end of this year, for diplomatic relations to be restored between them. What I think is happening is that Saudi Arabia is attempting to try and pass the blame onto Qatar. I think Saudi Arabia is acutely aware that more and more people in the world are aware that they are linked to terrorism. They are actually the leading exporter of terrorism in the world. So I think by trying to blame its partner in crime, Qatar, it's a way of shifting the blame onto the Qataris. It's a way of trying to cause confusion in the minds of people in the West. For example, in Britain, during the recent general election campaign, I was delighted to see Jeremy Corbyn bring up Saudi Arabia in the context of extremism. So a lot of British people are now thinking, when they hear Saudi Arabia, is it connected to terrorism? So I think by the Saudis attempting to say, we don't want to have diplomatic relations with Qatar anymore because they're supporters of terrorism, extremism, some British people think, well, maybe they are on our side, they are fighting against terrorism. So I don't think it's an actual falling out between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. I think a lot of it is being stage managed, and I think it's a way, as I said, of Saudi Arabia trying to blame Qatar for what's happened. I mean, the irony, of course, is that Qatar is a leading exporter of terrorism to the world, but Saudi Arabia is the number one.
Yes, I mean, as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said about a conflict between two other countries, it's a pity both can't lose. And that will be the feeling of many people watching this. I'm in no doubt that of the two, Saudi Arabia is by far and away the bigger criminal, both in terms of quantum of crime and the quality of crime. I do think it is a real fallout. In fact, they were never friends to begin with. It's true that both have been supporting terrorism, but generally speaking, different terrorist groups. They all cut your throat, they all eat your heart, they all blow up your church or your mosque if you are a worshipper who doesn't quite fit into their very narrow groove. So in that sense, if you're a victim of one gang of terrorists or another, it doesn't make much difference. But it makes a difference to the people who are paying for it, to the patrons of it. They support different factions in Libya, different factions in Syria, and different factions in Yemen. In fact, Qatar seems to be, Al Jazeera seems to have suddenly discovered that there's a major crisis in Yemen over the last few weeks. I'm happy about that. There's more rejoicing in heaven at the one sinner who doth repent than to the fidelity of the 99 who hath no need of repentance. So welcome back, Qatar, to the Yemen cause. So I do think that it's a genuine fallout. Indeed, it's an existential one, because from Saudi Arabia's point of view, Qatar should not actually exist as a separate independent state. It's rather like the feeling of almost all Iraqis that Kuwait should not exist, because it was taken from the Iraqi motherland by the British, and the Saudis feel the same about Qatar, and indeed about other satrapies in the Gulf. So it goes back to year one. The Saudi Arabians have never actually accepted the legitimacy, the validity of the existence of Qatar, and now that it's one of the world's richest countries and has used its wealth rather more intelligently than Saudi Arabia has in purchasing brand, tennis tournaments, motor racing, and of course the ultimate prize of the World Cup. Saudi Arabia has none of these things. Nobody in their right mind would want to have anything to do with Saudi Arabia. That has not been true of Qatar. And Qatar has very strategically purchased very important pieces of real estate, whether Paris Saint-Germain, the football team in France, or the Shard and other landmark buildings in London. Qatar's leaders have been rather sharper on their feet than the rather leaden-footed Saudis, which has, of course, only increased the enmity between them. Yes, madam.
It's Dr. Hala Diab. I'm author, writer, and filmmaker.
Welcome, doctor.
I want to talk about actually the Syrian crisis in relation to the Qatari situation, and I want to really go back to your first introduction when you spoke about the rebels fighters, so-called rebel fighters in Syria. We all know that that crisis now in Gulf will affect the situation in Syria in a way that it will not really weaken the rebels group, because the rebels have no loyalty, not to Saudis, not to the Qatari, not to anyone. The loyalty is to who fund them, to their own interest. But there will be more kind of tension between these factions, which are supported by different allies and countries, and that might bring into the center of the Syrian crisis countries like Russia, Iran, and Turkey to be more involved in the Syrian crisis. I mean, from the political point of view, for sure, the opposition, who have been actually funded by some countries in the Gulf, they will not have any political stance according towards the crisis, because at the end of the day, they just sell their they don't have morals actually or values. They sell them accordingly to who pays more. But I think we have to look more on whether the crisis will help Syrian conflict to a little bit come into resolution, and I think that might happen, because the pressure from the Gulf states at the moment is not as big as it was, because they are busy with their own problems.
I think that's correct. Perhaps a more pertinent impact will be on the Kurdish-Turkey question. If Saudi Arabia is seriously going to make a big effort to help Kurdish secessionism in the north of Syria, this is going to make Turkey very angry indeed. And they've said that they are going to do so. There are early signs that they are going to do so. Of course, as in the conflict with Qatar, Saudi Arabia ultimately will accept its orders from Washington. Although one of the problems is, what are the orders from Washington? Who is giving them? You get different orders from Tillerson than you get from President Trump if he's still the president at the time of recording.
I want to go back to the visit of Trump to the region, which really caused a little bit of question marks about what happened after that visit. Trump's priority is to get rid of ISIS and, you know, the terrorist group.
Really?
That's what he said in his propaganda, and that's what actually will
That was
win
lost in
him.
translation for me.
It's actually the key for his credibility in the United States. So he wants to show the Americans that he's fighting terrorism. And through kind of creating kind of tension between the Gulf states, he will alienate them a little bit, let them be busy with their own problem, and then he will focus more on involving the Americans in the Syrian crisis, whether it's on political level or on military level.
No, I think that the early signs are that President Trump, if he's still the president, is withdrawing from Syria. The recent presidential order to cease arms and other shipments to so-called moderate rebels in Syria seems to be a return by Trump to his pre-election rhetoric, which we were all quite hopeful about. But I think you're making a mistake if you're looking for any consistency at all in Donald Trump's policy. I have come to the conclusion that Trump himself doesn't know what he's going to do tomorrow or in the next hour. And we have to wait his rather bizarre Twitter feed before we know exactly what he's going to do. Certainly there's more than one foreign policy in the US. There may be three. There may be a State Department policy, a presidential policy, and a Pentagon policy. It wouldn't be the first time that that had happened, but it would be the first time that the State Department and the Pentagon were more powerful than the White House. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Ali Al-Faiz, political activist from Bahrain. I think there is a dilemma here. United States in particular discovered their tools has been defeated in Iraq, Syria, and almost in Yemen. And as the doctor said, they wanted to have a scapegoat. So they have to manage their exit somehow. Especially they're having a talk with Russia nowadays. Now, on a level of values and promoting democracy and human rights, they have failed miserably, because the one who sent rebels from all around the world to Syria to fight the dictatorship, what they call dictatorship, are the one who does not have an election in their countries. In fact, they sent their troops to Bahrain to find a peaceful revolution because they ask for election and democracy. And the one who claim there is a terrorism today supported by Qatar, or Qataris claim there is terrorism supported by UAE or Saudi, and in Bahrain is in the picture, they accuse human rights activists in Bahrain as terrorists. So there is a big problem with values and promotion of human rights and democracy. And they've been exposed big time. So the scapegoat is to put the blame on Qatar. Especially Saudi is being defeated in Iraq, in Syria, and now in Yemen. And the question is whether they will be competing or fighting in Syria, or this battle will be moved to the Gulf. That's a big question now, because in the first 3 days, we heard information that Saudi wanted to invade Qatar and change the political system there. Now, for some reason, probably one of them is Turkey moving to Qatar, they stopped. Now, are they going to have this fight inside Qatar and inside Riyadh? You know, this question will be answered in the coming weeks and months.
Well, it's a big question, of course, one that's pregnant with many ramifications. It's my view that the United States will continue to dictate the policy of all three of these satrapies. The Saudi Crown Prince will do what the US tells him, Qatar will do what the US tells them, and the UAE will do what the US tells them. The problem is, having marched like the grand old Duke of York in the English nursery rhyme, having marched 10,000 men to the top of the hill, it's very difficult for the Saudis to march them all down again and retain any kind of self-respect, any kind of respect in the region. So in that sense, in my view, Qatar has already won this standoff, because Saudi made a démarche with a very short deadline. You must do the following things, and Qatar did none of them. And now the pressure on Qatar is becoming less. So I see the Saudi regime as having been weakened more by this, which may embolden the enemies of the current power in Riyadh, including inside their own family. We both know that the transfer of power was not an uncontested one. Neither has it been accepted by all in the royal family. And it has put in a position of power a 30-year-old man with a track record now of monumental failure throughout the region, which is not a good look when it comes to an internal power struggle. But there'll be much more of this after the break. You're watching كلمة حرة with me, George Galloway, here on Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, but discussing how could we be doing otherwise. Events not just in the Gulf, but in Jerusalem, in Syria, in Turkey, and in the Yemen. It's all coming out now. But we took the كلمة حرة camera out onto the streets of London to hear what the public think. Take a look at this.
Do you think the Gulf crisis are affecting the situation in Syria?
Yeah, big time. I'm not sure, because I'm not really up to all that politics, but I know it's not right what's going on over there.
Probably it has.
I think it's been used as a smokescreen to deflect and diverge everyone's attention away from what's really happening in Syria.
Well, at the moment, I think it is. Yeah, with the problem with Qatar being sort of with the problems they've got there of refusing their airspace and everything else. Yeah, I think it is affecting it.
I assume it does, but I'm not too sure, to be honest.
Do you think the Syrian conflict is getting better or worse after the Gulf crisis?
Haven't heard that much about it in the news, but it seems like general vibe is that it's getting worse.
Do you think the Gulf crisis is indirectly helping Assad to stay in power?
Yeah, it is helping him stay in power, but Allahu A'lam.
الإرهاب الخليجي كان هاجم على الأسد، ولكن يبدو أن الأسد لأنه من مع محور المقاومة سوف يثبت، لكن الخليجيين المشاكل اللي بينهم كانت تحت الطاولة، الآن طلعت خارج الطاولة. يعني نشوف المشاكل بين السعودية والإمارات وقطر والبحرين، يعني نشوفها فجور وفسوق في المشاكل.
Well, that was the view from some of the people on the street, one of them actually living on the street. That first fellow who was sitting down with the beard and who was a poor soul, really, he used to be a British soldier. And it's one of the more perverse aspects of contemporary British society that a very significant proportion of people living on the street, as indeed a significant proportion of people in prisons and in mental health treatment, are ex-soldiers. So in Britain, we wave our soldiers off to war, but when they come back, we don't want to know them. Well, there wasn't much wisdom, I felt, in the points that were made from the street, and that's a symptom of confusion. Because when you have two allies, as Britain has, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, both big allies of Britain, big customers and big investors in Britain. When these two allies begin to fall out and that there might be actually a war between them, well, who do you choose, Tweedledee or Tweedledum? Let's go behind. Take the gentleman in the middle.
So Abu Saud, what I reckon for last couple of years, what's happening with Saudi, they're acting like Uncle Sam of Middle East. So the country which came up against them is Qatar. Now, what ironically we are seeing a tit-for-tat decision between Turkey about the Kurdish. It's on the doorstep. Now, Qatar is going for Yemen. But who are the loser? Muslim of Middle East and Far East or Southeast Asian Muslim. We are losing. The other people who are the supplier of defense equipment, they're laughing all the way to the bank. So it's in the interest of America to keep us busy, keep fighting in the name of peace. But we have seen the change from Obama to Trump. Trump, first time he's against the Muslim. First visit, where did he make? Saudis. And the condition of Saudis was that the king must come to receive him at the airport, near the plane, which he did. The man who can't even walk. And he's aided from room to room. He managed to come there and throw lots of money for Trump, made him happy. But unfortunately, I see this is a sad thing for all the Muslims of the world. We're not going to win, and we're not winning either. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that sums it up very succinctly. Yes, sir, please.
I'm very confused because Russia and America, they are enemies of each other, but they're both fighting in Syria. And Iran and Saudi Arabia, they are also against each other, but they're both involved in Syria. So why those big enemies, instead of going to Syria, fight between themselves and decide?
Well, that's a very good and simple point. These are proxy battles, but there's an important difference between them, and it's one that is very rarely pointed out in Britain. The Russian military presence in Syria is entirely legal. In fact, the Russians are the only national armed forces who are legally in Syria alongside the Syrian army. The American presence is entirely illegal. It is against the express wishes of the government of Syria, and it has no United Nations authority to act extraterritorially without the approval of the Syrian government. So on both levels, it is entirely illegal. And that goes for the presence in the skies of British air power and on the ground of British so-called special forces. And it goes for France, and it goes for all the other state actors that are involved in Syria. So it's true that there's a lot of foreign involvement in the Syrian conflict. Some of it is legal, and the rest of it is illegal. And once again, just as in the Iraq conflict next door in 2003, we're the ones on the illegal side. Yes?
Yes, but the point is that only yesterday they were, they were very happy that the IS has been defeated, and all they were showing the pictures.
Well, they're happy it's defeated in Mosul.
Yeah, Mosul.
They're not so happy that it's defeated in Syria.
But at the expense of the whole city has been demolished.
Not quite the whole city, but a very substantial
You only see
proportion
the
of the city.
ruins on the pictures.
And tens of thousands of civilian deaths. But that was a heroic liberation. The liberation of Aleppo was a war crime, even though the battle was against exactly the same people, and the methodology of that battle was identical. But it's another example.
But in both cases, the Muslims have suffered.
Well, this is what I was going to come back to, and this is the point that your neighbour also made. I didn't say it because I'm tired of saying it, and because, in a way, ennui precluded it. But as you've raised it, it is a pitiful sight. All these Arabs murdering each other on an industrial scale. All this treasure given to people who have exploited and occupied the Arabs for centuries in order to buy their favor here and there. Meanwhile, the unarmed and defenseless Palestinians are rising up in defense of the third holiest Muslim place in the world, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the compound. And nothing could more sharply, vividly illustrate how pitiful has the Arab world's leadership become. Because in any sane world, all the Arabs would be united in defense of Jerusalem. And the Palestinians defending it would not be left alone to do so. But they are left alone, and not just for the reason I've stated. Because, in fact, it's not just that the Arab rulers are not supporting the Palestinians, it is that most of the Arab rulers are actually supporting the Israeli occupiers. And this is a new thing. In the past, the Arab rulers, with very few exceptions, most of them now dead, were at least paying lip service to some of the demands of the Palestinians and couldn't have any relations with Israel at all. It was, if not an article of faith, it was an insurance policy. They knew that if they were caught out openly collaborating with the Israeli occupation, this could be curtains for them. But now all concealment, all efforts at concealment have been abandoned. And they openly, I mean, they are belly dancing in the shopping malls of occupied Palestine. They are belly dancing for the edification of the occupiers of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is new. And until now, they have gotten away with it, but maybe not forever. Yes, you, sir?
I think you touched the point here. The whole tragedy we see in the Middle East is for two reasons, oil and Israel. And the attack on Bashar al-Assad, I do recognize the rights of Syrian people for self-determination, democracy, election, human rights, and so on. But the whole thing is they attack him for first reason is because he is in resisting and fighting Israel. And probably the second reason could be the first is the gas thing, which is going to move from Qatar all the way to Europe. Now, the sad part of it is these undemocratic systems have been using our wealth, our blood, to fuel such war for so long in favor of Israel, which we're supposed to fight. And unfortunately, probably majority of the Arabs, in fact Muslims, have accepted the ideas for some time that there is a Shia-Sunni war, or there is sometime democracy promotion. We're fighting for democracy. I think at this point of time, because we're seeing the battle moving now from Syria to the Gulf, people must realize that these are tools to make Israel exist more and take our wealth outside of our region. And I hope by that time we have some oils and some blood in our body.
Let's go to the back. Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Thank you, George.
Distinguished-looking gentleman. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. George, it's just to follow up something you said earlier on in your introduction, and something perhaps you didn't mention but is relevant, is that the fact that the Qatar doesn't have a US ambassador at the moment. That may be corrected by the time this program airs, but it's telling that Washington is doing direct diplomacy through Tillerson in his visits to the region to sell weapons, to stir up the conflict and then quash it. It's an interesting game that the Americans are playing. But to come back to Britain, there was something you did mention, which is the Saudis basically have compromised so much of the British establishment. I'm thinking of your movie where you mentioned the Al Yamama arms agreement, arms sales, and the way that the Metropolitan Police was compromised by
Tony Blair.
In his in closing the Serious Fraud Office investigation into this scam, this arms deal. The Saudis pull strings that the Qataris can't. They may have property here, but the Saudis still have the real power in that we're still selling them weapons. Every one of the prime ministers that we've had in the last 7 years has continued that. So we've had Gordon Brown, we've had Theresa May recently selling weapons, and we've also had David Cameron, notably. So that the conflict in Syria, the conflict that the Saudis have stoked up and have raised to a crescendo to the point where now it could all fall apart, it's just interesting that Britain still will never betray Saudi Arabia.
Well, Britain invented Saudi Arabia and its ruling family. They eased it into power. It's ironic. One of the sticks with which the Saudis beat the Qataris is that the royal family there were handpicked by the British. As a matter of fact, not only were the Saudi rulers handpicked by the British, they were handpicked by a British woman called Gertrude Bell. She wouldn't be allowed to drive a car in Saudi Arabia now. I'll be right back. You're watching كلمة حرة with me, George غالاوي, here in London for Al Mayadeen Television, talking about the crisis in the Gulf and the impact of that crisis on other parts of the Arab Middle East. We took the Al Mayadeen camera out onto the streets of London. Here's what the people thought.
Do you think the Saudi support for the Kurds is genuine, or is it a punishment for Turkey for allying with Qatar?
I don't know. There are a lot of things, like I said before, that we don't see, that happens behind closed doors that we don't know about.
Pass. I haven't got a clue.
يعني السعودية بعد هزيمتها في سوريا والعراق وبعض الدول، وهزيمتها أيضا في اليمن، لأن في اليمن ما انتصرت السعودية، وهي اللي كانت تقيد الكوليشن على اليمن، الحرب على اليمن. هزيمة يعني نكراء إلى السعوديين، لأنهم ما حققوا أي هدف من أهدافهم اللي قادوها على اليمن أو على سوريا أو على البحرين أو على بعض الدول.
And do you think Saudi's support for the Kurdish people, the Kurdish rebels in Syria, is a punishment for Turkey?
I don't really know. I mean, I'm not that in tune with that side of the politics of it, but I mean, if it is, then it's not really. We should be treating everyone the same.
But I'm not informed enough to tell you about this.
Do you think Saudi's support for the Kurds in Syria is a punishment for Turkey for allying with Qatar?
To be honest, I don't know too much about the situation. I think it would be more useful for everyone to be more well informed about it, then they could form better opinions.
It is, I must say, remarkable that Britain, which had so much to do with how things are today in the Arab world and how events in the Arab world are so very important to the peace and security of the world that virtually nobody in Britain knows anything at all. And for those watching this from overseas, I at least am a bit embarrassed about my fellow countrymen and women and their ignorance. And I've been shouting for well over 40 years. I wonder how many are listening. Yes, Doctor, go ahead.
To go back to the crisis in the Gulf, and I think that we forget that there is an ideological side of it, not only political or military aspect, because we forget the other players, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, they fed up with the Muslim Brotherhood and the support that Qatar gives to Muslim Brotherhood, especially that Qatar has been very vocal against Sisi and the government the new government in Egypt. And also because the ideological rise of Sufism in United Arab Emirates and in Egypt against the rise of Salafism and Wahhabism, while in Qatar there are a lot of Muslim Brothers leaders, taking refuge there in that country. So we can't talk about the crisis without talking about Egypt and other players and United Arab Emirates and other countries and the ideological conflict that is there between these countries.
Well, try and explain that out on the street of Britain. That complicates it even more. I did in the previous program analyze in some detail the ideological, theological differences, and you have recapped on some of them. Qatar is the banker to the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey is the muscle for the Muslim Brotherhood. That's true. Saudi Arabia is terrified of the Muslim Brotherhood because if anybody overthrows the regime in Saudi Arabia, it will probably be the Muslim Brotherhood. At the same time, the West, which played a significant role in the development of the Muslim Brotherhood, on the age-old principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So let's develop a Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a counterweight to the rise of Arab nationalism, later Nasserism in Egypt. Let's develop an Islamist trend in the Palestinian national movement, which became Hamas, to cause problems for the nationalist leadership of President Arafat. And then there's the rather inconvenient fact that actually the Muslim Brotherhood won the presidency in Egypt and the military, Western-backed military, overthrew it. And the actual president of Egypt is in prison, and a man in a uniform goes around claiming that he was somehow fairly elected as the president. So there are some of us, not you, but there are some of us who are against the Muslim Brotherhood and against military dictatorship too. We're against Western puppets, whether they're wearing Islamic garb or military uniforms. In that sense, we are consistent. Others are not so consistent. They're with the Muslim Brotherhood here, but against it there. They're with Sunnis here, but with Shias there. It's very important in life, I have found, in what has not been mercifully a short life, to try and follow the Northern Star, to be constant and to be consistent in one's attitude. Let's hear from Dr. Marcus. Go ahead, sir.
I'd like to make a few points. First of all, I would argue that the primary reason as to why the Americans are trying to overthrow the Syrian government is to end Russia's influence and power in the Middle East, because Syria, for over 50 years, has been Russia's eyes and ears in that region. Effectively, Syria to Russia is what Israel is to America. And we have a Russia which is resurgent on the international arena, something that we should rejoice. And Russia is the only country in the world that can challenge American global supremacy. So if the Americans can overthrow the Syrian government, then they can dent Russia's resurgence. And the Americans are doing exactly the same in Ukraine. The reason they're trying to bring Ukraine into the West's orbit is to weaken Russia in Europe, and a weakened Russia in Europe is a weakened Russia in the world. The next point I'd like to make is that we hear a lot about Syria being a police state, a lack of democracy, human rights violations. Well, excuse me, but there's a lot to police when you have a brutal, villainous organisation like the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's something that should actually be told in Western capitals. The other point I'd like to make is that in regard to the Gulf crisis having an impact on the conflict in Syria, there is no indication, there is no tangible evidence to demonstrate that it is having an impact. I mean, if you were to tour the front lines across Syria and speak with the Syrian soldiers there, they would tell you that the terrorists, be it the so-called Free Syrian Army, al-Nusra, ISIS, etc., are still receiving fighters, they're still receiving weapons, and they're still receiving money as well. The last point I'd like to make is regarding Trump. You know, Trump has had decades-long extensive relations with Saudi Arabia. And I think the day he became president was really an even worse day for Syria, because just days before he actually attacked that Syrian airbase this April, he actually signed a $200 billion deal with Saudi Arabia, whereby Saudi Arabia would invest $200 billion in American Saudi enterprises. Lo and behold, 1 week or 10 days later, America attacks Syria. So I think we need to be very careful about Trump. And we heard it a few months ago that Trump was going to scale back American involvement in Syria. Well, that never happened. And President Assad gave an interview to a Chinese media outlet. He said the same thing. We've heard recently that Trump is going to end support for the terrorists in Syria. Well, recently, Foreign Minister Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, was asked about that, and he confirmed the Kremlin's view that there is no evidence whatsoever that Trump is going to stop supporting the terrorists in Syria.
Yes, of course, much of what you say I agree with, but just like with your fellow doctor, I must insist on my belief that we have to avoid false dichotomies. You see, Syria is a police state. It is a dictatorship. There may be reasons, as you allude, but it is. You don't have to take my word for that. You can take President Assad's word for that. President Assad himself has instituted, just in the last couple of weeks, major changes in the governance of Syria. He has dispatched legal teams to Aleppo. He has sacked governors. He has been very clear that this great victory that has been won in Syria means that the status quo ante is no longer an option. And so we mustn't be more Catholic than the Pope. We mustn't be more Ba'athist than President Assad. We have to accept that one of the reasons for the revolts in these countries is the lack of democracy. See, I've got news for you, Doctor. You don't have to be in the Muslim Brotherhood to be picked up by the Syrian secret police. If we lived in Syria 5 years ago, you and I would have been sharing a cell, having been arrested by the Syrian secret police, because you and I are free men who say what we think. Now, until recently, that was quite a serious crime in Syria, and would definitely have landed you in the prison cell, and God help you once you got there. So let's not be more royal than the king, more Catholic than the Pope. Let's not be more Assadist than Assad. Yes, sir.
I think the point Doctor mentioned, in my views, is not right, because if Assad today, at this point of time, stop his relation with Iran and Hezbollah, the whole thing in Syria will stop immediately. It's not about Russia at all. It's about resisting Israel and their project in the Middle East. That's it. I think even the gas is not a big issue when it comes to having the policy of Assad in line with the policy of United States and opening up at least a backdoor with Israel. I think the problem is not with religion, not with brotherhood, not with Shiism, not with Sunnism, not with anything. Because when Shia was in line with the United States, Saudi used to go there and, bow to him and, kiss his hand. But when the change happened, suddenly Shiism become an issue. Brotherhood, at a point of time, they were welcomed. In fact, Brotherhood today is a major part of Bahraini government because they use it to suppress the other people's demand for democracy. Unfortunately, the religion is used here as a second layer, a second tool to suppress people. We have a say in Islam, الناس صنفان إما أخ لك في الدين أو نظير لك في الخلق. People are too kind. One of them is your brother in religion or brother in humanity, human being. But these people does not understand that at all. They do understand politics and how they become more influential and they can, take step and be more loyal to the United States. Unfortunately, that's the situation. And Brotherhood is not worse than Wahhabism. Wahhabism is the much more worse. The ideology which support ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Nusra and others, mainly is Wahhabism. All the terrorist attack we see in London, France, Germany, all over is Wahhabi-backed ideology. And you know who created that? United Kingdom.
Well, it didn't create it, of course, but it did its best to bring it to power. It designed Saudi Arabia around it. I don't think it's either or. Look, I think that Syria became the bête noire, the main enemy in the Middle East of the West, not for any of the bad things about Syria, not because it's one family rule, not because it's one party rule, not because there have been no human rights or real democratic liberties there, because that's true of everywhere in the Middle East. They hate Syria for the good things about Syria, not the bad things. They hate Syria because it refuses to accept Israeli occupation of its land. It refuses to abandon the Palestinian cause. It gave Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, an honored place at their table, which Hamas ate from for decades, when no other Arab country would go near it. They hate Syria because of its relationship to the Lebanese resistance, the heroes of the Lebanese resistance. They hate it because of its refusal to break relations with Iran. And they hate it because it has close relations with Russia, which they fear. So all of these reasons are reasons to support Syria, which is why I have done so. But that doesn't require me to pretend that there are no bad things about the Syrian regime. And President Assad isn't pretending that either. We'll be right back with the last segment of this كلمة حرة after this. Welcome to كلمة حرة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television here in London, but talking about, of course, the various crises crisscrossing the Arab Middle East. Let's go straight to the audience. Yes, madam, what would you like to say?
My name is Warda and I'm a Yemeni. I'm not a political person, but I became a political person today and interested in political because of the bloodshed in Yemen. And in the other Arab countries, of course. I don't feel. I'm still in a confusion. I don't know exactly what's happening with the whole thing since the spring of the Arab Spring. But I know deep inside the first mission for them was to put the corruption of all the politics down, and not to put the corruption of innocent people down. So what we see now, a lot of innocent people are dying in our street. So what is the first? What is your word or your message to the innocent people who are in the street, just wondering and confused about the whole situation?
Well, the Arabs are currently swimming in their own blood, and your country is, of course, just one of the disaster areas. And the people who are bombing you are fellow Arabs and fellow Muslims, and they're doing it for the delight of people who don't care about Arabs or Muslims. And of course, we don't have time, but we could tour the horizon over the last 100 years and see what the real purpose of colonialism is. And if I was to put it in a nutshell, they want to steal your things. And they want to have puppet regimes, whether corrupt kings or puppet presidents, who will rule the land in the interest not of their own people, but of our Western people, who will spend your money in the West rather than invest it in your own lands. And if a conflict arises in those puppet states, and there's a chance that the puppet might be overthrown, of course they will do everything that they can to assist the puppet to crush their enemies. And it gets more problematic when the puppet wants to cross the lines and crush people in a neighboring state, like in Bahrain, like in Yemen, both of which have been subject to outright invasion by the Saudi kingdom. And it becomes slightly less complicated when they do it through proxies, as they have done in Libya, for example, and in the destruction of Syria. But I take great hope in two things. In what I'm watching on the television in Jerusalem today, and the echo that that is having throughout the Arab world, from Marrakesh to Bahrain, and in the victory of the Syrian Arab army. A Sunni army, by the way. 80% Sunni army. Very important to those who pretend that the division in Syria is a sectarian one. Let me go to the gentleman, yes, in the middle.
Absar Ahmed from Harrow on the Hill.
Welcome.
Why this America and Britain are giving arms aid to these countries like Saudi Arabia, who are doing damage to poor countries like Yemen and all that? So,
well, it's not aid, of course, it's sales.
Sale, why?
Which is the key point. They're not giving aid, they're receiving big bucks.
That should stop first.
Well, of course, we have discussed this on Kalimahara. We will again. The gentleman at the back raised the Al Yamama deal, the biggest sale of anything by anyone to anybody in all history. And it was all a theft from the Saudi people. It represents grand larceny, the biggest heist in history, whereby tens of billions of the Saudi people's money was effectively recycled in kickbacks back to the princes who negotiated the deal. So brazen that the British police were about to charge executives of the arms company and Saudi criminals when Tony Blair came in and closed the entire operation. This gentleman back here.
Taking the leaf from my next door neighbor, say, we know in Iraq war, Hans Blix, what did he say? If I had a month more to do the survey, I knew this was all false, war of mass destruction. So then what happened? Britain, I was there in the parliament called by my MP, Gareth Thomas, with Jeff Hoon and other secretary with me at that time. They said, we are going for a war. 2 days later, the bombardment we have seen in picture, it was showed in CNN. So now we can see why UNO has got no value. U for USA, rest is no. So UNO had powerless to stop America and 28 other countries to invade. And that carried out then, and will carry out in future, which I can envisage. Thank you.
Well, things are on the change. The Chinese were premature in describing the United States as a paper tiger. It's still not a paper tiger yet, but it's definitely an old tiger that's on its way out. And new tigers are arriving on the scene with far sharper claws than that. Yes, the lady, and then finally Dr. Marcus. Yes, madam.
I just want to go back to one of the things that you discussed at the beginning of the show about whether the crisis will affect the situation in Syria in regards to the leadership of Bashar al-Assad. I don't believe that the leadership of Bashar al-Assad will be influenced by the Gulf crisis, whether Qatar is a best friend with Saudi Arabia or not. Because 6 years ago, or 6 years from the start of the so-called Syrian revolutions, the leadership is getting stronger and stronger. Because I think that the Syrian people today, they realize that the Syrian crisis was not actually a way for bettering the situation in Syria, rather than it brought damage and destruction to this country.
Well, a revolution has to have both form and content. This revolution in the beginning had a form, the form of popular revolution, but its content the Syrian people have looked at and recoiled from, because the Syrian people are not Afghans. They're not Saudis. Syria is a sophisticated, Levantine, multi-ethnic and multi-religious society. Yeah. Whatever its political problems, the Syrian people would never go quietly into the future as envisaged by these fanatics.
But also, if we look at Syria 5-6 years ago, it was at its peak of thriving as a country of liberation, or on the way to be, better a country in the Middle East. But I think that some people in Syria, especially the young people, they were misled because of all these logos of freedom and democracy and the human rights. And I think that could have been reached in a better way, where people should be involved in politics, in political reform, than just walking in the street and asking for because we can't ask just the state to be destroyed in order to build a better state. We need to invest in what we are good about.
Well, you can ask for the state to be destroyed if you are going to build a better state.
But if you can't...
Their proposal was to build a worse state. Their proposal was, whatever is wrong with Syria, we'll make it 10 times worse. Just like Libya. I mean, not everyone agrees with me, even in this room. I think Gaddafi was a disastrous ruler. And it's therefore an act of genius to make Libya 10 times worse than it was under Gaddafi. And if Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the alphabet soup of extremism that was poured by the West into the Syrian war, if they had prevailed, every problem in Syria would be 10, if not 100 times worse. You wouldn't be sitting on a television program in the Syria that these people had in mind, because you'd be completely invisible, and you would not be allowed out on the street except with your husband or your brother. And you certainly wouldn't be allowed to have an opinion on a television program. In fact, you wouldn't be allowed to sit in the same restaurant as the rest of us. And you wouldn't be allowed any freedom, even of your own religion. All religious places that didn't suit the fanatics would have been destroyed. All churches would have been destroyed. All Muslim minorities would have been destroyed, and their people massacred. And even those Sunni clerics and mosques that didn't pass muster with al-Baghdadi, as he was falsely known before the Russians did us all a favor in removing him from this earth, and may he burn in hell for eternity. If you didn't pass muster with al-Baghdadi, whether you were a Sunni or a Shia, your head would be taken from your shoulders, and if you were particularly unlucky, your heart would be eaten live on television for the edification of the others. So my point is not that we should say that Syria for the last 30 years has been a wonderful place. It has not.
For some people,
But
it was.
Well, indeed it was. That's part of the problem. For some people, it was. But Syria under Al-Qaeda and ISIS, it would have been 100 times worse. Doctor, last word is yours.
Can I say, when people are observing how the United Nations has been utterly sidelined over Yemen and, of course, Iraq, to really understand that, people have got to get to the roots. And the roots of this is during the 1990s, when the West destroyed international law, destroyed the UN Charter, destroyed the Helsinki Agreement, when it dismembered the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. What happened in Yugoslavia laid the foundation for Afghanistan, for Iraq, for Libya, Yemen and Syria. And I have to admit, I do find it frustrating when people often talk about what happened in Iraq. And of course, it was utterly criminal. And I sincerely hope that one day George Bush and Tony Blair will suffer for it. But the roots of that was in the former Yugoslavia, when the West recognized the independence of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, destroyed Tito's Yugoslavia, and then a few years later tore Kosovo away from Serbia. So if you want to understand the roots of how the United Nations has been sidelined by the Americans and the British over Iraq, over Yemen, you must go back to the 1990s and study what happened to Yugoslavia.
Well, in my film, The Killings of Tony Blair, I make exactly these points. It's not just that this destruction of Yugoslavia created the doctrine for further destruction and invasion of other countries, but the rush of blood to the head in the form of Tony Blair and his messianic pretensions was tipped over the edge in Yugoslavia. To be transformed from a rather wimpish Oxford boater to a war leader who could unleash death and destruction and actually destroy a country and be hailed for it by some, became an intoxicating brew for Tony Blair. And it led, as I knew that it would at the time, which is why I opposed in Parliament under the leadership of Mr. Tony Benn. I opposed the Yugoslav war with all of my breath because I knew that having destroyed Yugoslavia, they would go on to destroy more, much more. But I believe that they have reached the end of their strength on these matters. They will not be invading and occupying anyone else, because not only have they not the strength to do so, others have the strength to stop them. Russia, China, increasingly in the years to come, no one will accept that the manifest destiny of the United States of America stretches to invading and occupying their countries. We love America, we just don't want to be ruled by them. That's the feeling of most people in the world. This has been كلمة. I've been George Galloway, and you have been a marvellous audience. Thanks very much for watching.